Okay, hi everyone. So this is lots of things. This is the final talk of the the Feminist Media and Cultural Studies Summer School, which for people online has been happening at Lancaster University this week. And we're also live streaming this to people who are joining this as the fourth event in the Digital Bodies seminar series that we've been running online over this term. And if anyone's interested in the other seminars, that we have them on our YouTube page for the Centre for Gender Studies at Lancaster. So I'm Laura Clancy, I'm the Director of the Centre for Gender Studies at Lancaster. And we're really pleased to have with us Jamie Hakim to do this talk. So Jamie is a lecturer in culture, media and creative industries at King's College London, and his research interests lie at the intersection of digital cultures, intimacy, embodiment and care. Can I just ask people online if you could just keep yourselves muted and the cameras off just for now, and then we can come to questions later on. Thank you, Jamie.
Okay, so can people hear me in and out the room? Okay, excellent. Okay, so hello everyone. As Laura has just explained, I'm Jamie Hakim. I'm a lecturer at King's. I'm also principal investigator on a project that I'm here to talk to you about today, Digital Intimacies. So this presentation has three parts. I'm going to start the talk by giving an overview of the project, specifically the methodological approach that we've taken, which is called conjunctural analysis. Then I'm going to talk you through the findings we've arrived at using this approach. And then finally, I'm going to reflect a little on the value of using conjunctural analysis to research questions of digital intimacy. And before I do any of that, I just want to thank Helen and Laura and everyone at the Centre for Gender Studies here at Lancaster for inviting me to speak today. It's really an honour and a pleasure to be here in person, and I'm looking forward to our discussion later. Okay. So Digital Intimacies is an ESRC funded project that is hosted across King's and Edinburgh University and partnered with the sexual health and wellbeing organisations, the Terence Higgins Trust, London Friend and Waverley Care. We're an interdisciplinary project drawing on expertise in cultural studies, the sociology of health and social anthropology. The question that we set out to answer is, how do UK-based queer men use their smartphones to negotiate their cultures of intimacy? And in posing this question, we wanted to make a couple of different interventions. Firstly, much work in this area rightly focuses on queer men's hookup app use. And whilst hookup app use has been absolutely central to the smartphone-mediated intimacies of the queer men we spoke to, other features of their smartphones have too. And by looking at these, we've been able to capture underexplored dynamics of these intimate cultures. We wanted to make an intervention in terms of the methodological approach that we've taken. The approach is called conjunctural analysis, and it emerged in the 1970s at the University of Birmingham's Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies under the directorship of Stuart Hall. Conjunctural analysis was developed in response to theoretical debates occurring in British Marxism over the role that the economy has in determining other aspects of a society: the political, technological, social, cultural, ideological, etc. Against so-called vulgar Marxism, which held that the economy determines all other aspects of a society, conjunctural analysis sees each of these aspects as having equal capacity to overdetermine each other in complex and unpredictable ways. The point of conjunctural analysis is to work out how these different aspects of society are shaping each other at a given moment in time, or historical conjuncture. In cultural studies, this is often done by analysing a particular cultural formation in relation to the historical conjuncture in which it has emerged. So different subcultures, media panics, forms of pop music are just some of the cultural formations that have been subject to conjunctural analysis. Taking this approach allows us to consider not only their historical significance, but also the shape and direction that the society in which they've emerged is moving in at a particular moment in time. So to give a concrete example of what this looks like, let's turn to the first piece of research produced by the CCCS that explicitly uses the term conjunctural analysis to describe what it's doing. Collectively authored Policing the Crisis, Mugging the State and Law and Order, which was published in 1978. The cultural formation it analysed was the moral panic on mugging that appeared across the UK media in the 1970s. Contrary to popular opinion, which understood this moral panic as directly reflecting an increase in mugging itself, Policing the Crisis concluded that this panic was instead symptomatic of the multifaceted crises that the UK was experiencing as a result of the breakdown of the post-war social democratic consensus. So anyone with a brief acquaintance with British social history will be familiar with the tropes that are often used to represent this crisis. The three-day week, the winter of discontent, the oil crisis, militant trade unions. The book argues in a grip on society during this conjuncture, one of the strategies adopted by the ruling classes was to frame the crisis not in political terms, but in terms of criminality, law and order. So for instance, the hippies were drug dealers, the trade unions were thugs, and so on. The media panic on mugging was an attempt by the ruling classes to displace the generalized feeling of anxiety caused by living through this crisis onto Black working class youth, who, the discourse went, simply needed better policing, hence the title of the book. The authors called the ideology that underpinned this strategy authoritarian populism, which was subsequently understood to be a precursor to the rise of Thatcherism, and explain the success of the Conservative Party in the general election the year after the book was published. So this is conjunctural analysis because they take a cultural formation, the moral panic on mugging in the UK media, and analysed it not only to understand its internal operations, but also, and perhaps more importantly, to illuminate key aspects of the wider conjuncture in which this panic emerged. So cultures of intimacy, queer, digital, or otherwise, are rarely the subject of conjunctural analysis. And we found this approach beneficial in a number of ways. So it moves beyond an exclusive focus on the platforms and technologies through which these intimacies are mediated. It also encourages us to look outside an exclusive focus on queer, social, and cultural histories, which are so often the analytical frames used to make sense of these queer men's social and cultural practices. Instead, in this context, conjunctural analysis foregrounds the fact that queer men inhabit the world as much as any other social group, albeit from a specific social location. And our cultures of intimacy and the way they are mediated are therefore shaped by a wide range of social forces. This has allowed us to see how queer men's smartphone-mediated cultures of intimacy are shaped by wider conjunctural dynamics, not often included in the analysis of these cultures, giving us a different understanding of their significance for queer men, as well as the worlds that we inhabit. It has also helped us understand aspects of the current conjuncture that analysing other cultural formations do not allow us to see. As I've just said, the domains of intimacy, sexuality, and embodiment are rarely, if ever, used by practitioners of conjunctural analysis to understand the shape and direction of particular conjunctures. These practitioners frequently focus on capital P politics, frequently election results, for this purpose. As I hope you'll see by the end of this talk, I believe there is real value in analysing cultures of embodiment, sex, and intimacy to get a sense of a historical moment. Even though these domains are frequently understood to be personal and private, from the point of view of conjunctural analysis, they are constructed through or overdetermined by their complex interrelationships to all the domains that constitute a social formation. Therefore, analysing them gives a unique perspective on the shape direction that a social formation is moving in, that analysing politics, economics, etc. does not. Specifically, as I'm about to show, using cultures of intimacy as a way into conjunctural analysis gives access to, in Raymond Williams's words, the structure of feeling of a conjuncture, the desires, affects, hopes, and fears that circulate through a society during a particular moment in time. To explain how we use conjunctural analysis, I will very briefly gloss over the methods we adopted, and I'm happy to elaborate on these in the Q&A session afterwards. The project has 3 work packages. Work package 1 explored the material conditions in which queer men use their smartphones to negotiate their cultures of intimacy. So, for instance, the technological infrastructures of their mediation, the physical spaces where the negotiations takes place, and the broader economic and political conditions which shape them. Work package 2 analysed how these cultures were represented in popular culture. So we performed discourse analysis of representation of queer men's smartphone-mediated intimacies on TV, film, social media, and so on. And in work package 3, we interviewed 43 queer men about how they use their smartphones to negotiate these cultures. The interviews were qualitative, in-depth, and semi-structured. And this slide represents the demographic breakdown of our sample of queer men. And just a brief look at this, we've tried to be as inclusive as possible across a whole range of kind of demographic categories. Okay, so I'm going to move on to our findings. So 2 major themes have emerged from our research. The first is vulnerability, and this emerged in 2 overlapping forms. The first was the ambivalent sense of vulnerability our participants wanted to feel in their intimate encounters, but that sometimes could feel too much to bear. The interviews will show you what we mean. The second was the vulnerability to different forms of violence that our participants were exposed to as they pursued their cultures of intimacy. The second theme was the use of the smartphone to gain a sense of control over these different forms of vulnerability. In relation to the first form of vulnerability, we opened every interview that we did with the question, what does intimacy mean to you? And a striking number of our participants answered by using the word vulnerability. So here are some examples. Thomas says, vulnerability is the key to intimacy for me. Miguel says, I think intimacy is you being comfortable with your vulnerabilities with another person. Gavin says, mutual vulnerability. You have ritualized vulnerability. And then Lucas says, I think I'm experiencing intimacy when I'm really putting myself out there and feeling vulnerable. So these quotes refer to the whole range of intimacies practiced by our participants, whether they were talking about monogamous, open or polyamorous relationships, dates, casual or regular hookups, or platonic friendships. So this is Miguel talking about the vulnerability of more ephemeral intimacies. He says, when you are, say, naked, that's when you are at your most vulnerable because you have no clothes, and the clothes you wear are an armor. So when you're stripped, no pun intended, you are at your most vulnerable. I do feel like when you share that with someone, it doesn't have to be super meaningful, but it is you presenting yourself at your most vulnerable. You're allowing someone in to see that and to experience that with you. And that can be a really good thing. For some people, it can be a really terrible thing. And there's a lot of people that are not comfortable with that. I've used this quote because it also points to the ambivalences of this sort of vulnerability, that it can be both good and terrible. And this, as you'll see, is something that explains why our participants might want to use their smartphones to control this sense of vulnerability from it slipping between good and terrible. This brings us to the second type of vulnerability, the vulnerability to the various violences that queer men are exposed to in their pursuit of intimacy. We're using the word violent kind of very capaciously here to refer to the range of physical, emotional, and symbolic violences that operate at different scales and intensities. So some of these were digital. For example, Adebisi mentioned the possibility of being catfished. Once you go into Grindr and you don't really know who these people are, and you know it could be a catfish. Anthony, who's a therapist, talks about the dangers of what in digital media studies is called context collapse, where different aspects of your life, the barriers between them collapse and these contexts kind of mix and mingle. So he says, I think that's also one bad thing with online stuff. Like, even if you don't talk to that specific person, if I had a client who saw me, I don't know, talking about all my favorite sexual positions, all that kind of stuff on Grindr, would I be taken seriously as a professional? Then there were the offline violences interviewees faced participating in their cultures of intimacy: homophobic, racist, transphobic, ableist, and so on. So to illustrate the multifaceted and intersectional nature of these violences, I'm going to draw on just one interview, the one we did with our participant Udam. So Udam identifies as a British Asian gay man. In his interview, he talked about facing such a strong degree of religious homophobia from his traditional Sikh parents that he moved out of his family home. He also talked at great length about the racism that he faced on the gay commercial scene. Udam also lives with cerebral palsy, which affects his motor function, including his speech. So he talked to us very candidly and movingly about the different forms of violence that he experienced, pursuing different aspects of his intimate life. Many of these violent encounters happened because people took advantage of his decreased motor abilities. So, for example, he talked about being robbed twice, once by a sex worker and once through extortion over the internet. He mentioned 2 occasions when he was sexually assaulted, once by someone he met from Grindr and one by his carer. He also talked about different situations where his speech impediment created difficulties. One where a hookup thought Udam was affecting it to mock him, and one where he was refused entry into a nightclub. Speaking to people in nightclubs, which we conceive of as kind of cultures, spaces where gay men are negotiating their cultures of intimacy. So speaking to people in nightclubs where loud music is played also poses problems. The gay scene in general is not nearly as accessible as it should be. So he talked specifically about the difficulties he had walking around Soho on the day of London Pride because the small streets were so tightly packed. The smartphone itself is inaccessible to Udam because he cannot use his fingers in the way that is necessary to operate the touchscreen. He also faced abuse on hookup apps. So this is from the interview. He says, one guy called me a retard on Grindr. He said, who's going to have sex with you? You're a retard, sorry. The amount of violence Udam has faced is clearly very shocking and upsetting. And no one else we spoke to recounted this level of violence in their pursuit of intimacy. So I'm not presenting it today as representative of the scale of violence faced by queer men on the gay scene, on or offline. I've included it here because Udam's experience illustrates some of the many forms of violence that gay and or Asian and or disabled men more generally can be and sometimes are vulnerable to as they negotiate their cultures of intimacy. The reason that our participants did not face this much violence was because the majority of them were highly adept at using their smartphones to control and mitigate against the violences they were vulnerable to. So this brings us to our second theme, control. And again, this splits in 2 ways. Firstly, the control over when the vulnerability they might want to experience with an intimate partner becomes a little too much to bear. And secondly, as a way of controlling the possibility of facing the sorts of violence that Udam had experienced so much of. So the following quote from interviewee Luca sums up this theme very concisely, or the first part anyway. He says, I see this with my boyfriends, where the topic is really important, but represents something for someone that is vulnerable. They would prefer to reach me on WhatsApp because they are more in control on when to stop and when to post, when they have more time to think about their words. So many other participants concurred, talking about using the various features of their phones, the camera, different hookup and social media applications, SMS, voice notes, etc., to get a feeling of control over the various ways this sort of vulnerability pervaded this part of their intimate lives. So Adebisi told an amusing anecdote in his interview, which illustrates the broad contours of this. He says, I went to the National Portrait Gallery with my boyfriend, and we played a game where it was like, oh, I bet I could pick you up if I just come up to you in the portrait gallery. Knowing that it was a game, and that was my boyfriend. When he was, oh, do you come here often? I was immediately like, Please don't talk to me. Please leave me alone. I'm just here to see the art. Immediately like shutting down the conversation. Then James, who did the interviews, asks, if you were to change that into an online setting, does that feel different from that experience in an offline setting? And Adebisi says, you can just ignore the message, or you can block them if it gets to that. But actually, they can't be in your space in that sort of way. Like, just because there's a message in your inbox doesn't mean that you have to acknowledge it, you know, in the way that, like, if someone were to come up to me and speak to me, I can't pretend as though I didn't hear them or see them. Like, we both know that, in fact, I've heard what they've said. I see them come up to me, and so it's sort of like, how do I extricate myself from this situation in a way that allows me to continue enjoying my time here or prevent like a scene, you know? So I'm including this anecdote again, not because it's representative or because I found it amusing, but because it offers a vivid illustration of the control the smartphone can afford in the realm of intimacy. So I read this quote as saying that Adebisi feels so unbearably vulnerable, even in role-playing flirting with a potential new intimate, who happens to be played by his actual boyfriend, that he immediately shuts down the flirtation. However, reimagined in an online setting, that vulnerability becomes far more manageable because he can just ignore or block another user's mediated advances. The digital in this context is a technology for managing the unbearability of intimacy's vulnerabilities. There were other ways the smartphone was used in this way. So some talked about controlling the pace of an intimate encounter. So Will liked to be able to decide when to send the men that he met on Grindr his phone number so the relationship could, in his words, graduate to WhatsApp. Some talked about controlling their image. Joe uses a wheelchair and talked about wanting to have control over when he reveals this part of his life. So it does not include a picture where his wheelchair is visible on his hookup app profiles, but then decides to send it in private messaging when he wants to. Gareth relished being able to use the chat functions of different social media apps to establish the boundaries of the BDSM encounters that he enjoyed organizing. Finally, there were the ways that our participants spoke of using the different affordances of their smartphones to gain a sense of control over the violences they faced in their pursuit of intimacy. So this is Udam on the digital techniques he used to protect against the possibility of being catfished. He says, I will make sure that his name is a real person. So I usually copy his name and I usually check it on Facebook, check if somebody's called that and check if it's him or not. Or I usually type a person on Google to check if that's the right person or not, because there are so many fake people out there. And below is Alex talking about the block function of hookup apps to gain a sense of control over transphobia. So something that trans folk have to deal with, that I have to deal with, are people who are out there specifically looking for trans folk, like cis people. I will get messages from people thousands of kilometers away who are literally like, I want a boy pussy. And I'm like, block. Adebisi specifically articulated that if he had to experience racism at all, his preference was that it happen online. Though it goes without saying, this is hardly a choice anyone should have to make. He says it's a lot easier to brush off stuff that happens online because you just exit and then it's gone. Now, I wouldn't want to imply that what we've taken from this is that digital technologies are the solution to fighting racism or indeed any other forms of abuse and violence. I just want to note here that our participants did speak about their phones in relation to violence. Sorry, that when our participants did speak about their phones in relation to violence, they did it not only did they talk about the ways it made them vulnerable to these different forms of violence, but they simultaneously spoke about the sense of control it gave them over the violence that this type of network media exposed them to. So before I start talking about these findings conjuncturally, I want to make a couple of points about how they contrast with existing research on and popular perceptions of queer men's cultures of intimacy. First relates to how intimacy is defined in the academic scholarship. So Ken Plummer defines intimacy as innermost thoughts and feelings. Lynn Jameson as relationships which are often described as the most important to people. Lauren Ballant defined intimacy as connections that people depend on for living. Shaka McLaughlin as the affective encounters with others that often matter most. The term vulnerability does occasionally appear in this scholarship, but mostly as a secondary term. Now, two of the most prominent writers to think about intimacy and vulnerability together are Anne Tvetovich, I always mispronounce her name, and Catherine Angel, both of whom write about women and intimacy. It's rare that the two terms come together in work on queer men, and yet it was the most common way that our participants defined intimacy. So this leads on to the second point. Association made by our participants between intimacy and vulnerability, and their use of smartphones to gain a sense of control over this vulnerability flat out contradicts the pervasive popular stereotype of queer men's cultures of sex and intimacy. So this stereotype has it that out of control, queer men use hookup apps to ferociously accumulate as many meaningless casual sex encounters as possible, often with damaging consequences for their mental health. There is little room for a term like vulnerability, at least in the way these men have spoken about it, within this conception of queer men's cultures of sex and intimacy. And of course, that stereotype might be the case for some men, but our findings show precisely the opposite. That being vulnerable with another person was critical to their understanding of their intimate lives, whichever type of intimacy they desired, including anonymous sex. And they used different aspects of their smartphones to make them feel like they are more in control as they negotiate these cultures. Now, the key question for us, given the approach we've taken, is why has this way of defining intimacy and of using smartphones emerged in this way now? What can this cultural formation tell us about queer men's lives and the conjuncture that we inhabit? To answer these questions, I'm going to put what our interviewee said into conversation with queer theory and some contemporary conjunctural analysis. Now, interestingly, vulnerability and control are key terms across both sets of literature, although vulnerability comes out more through the concept of sovereignty, or to be precise, non-sovereignty. We're going to get a little theoretical here. The term sovereignty means a state of having power or authority over something. In the queer theory literature on intimacy, the term non-sovereignty is used to refer to the fact that we never have full power or authority over our subjectivities because they're constituted through our relationship to the people and objects that we desire intimacy with. We believe that achieving intimacy with others will help us master the unsettling, sometimes unbearable experience of non-sovereignty and make us feel complete. This, according to this literature, however, is a fantasy. What some queer theorists call the fantasy of sovereignty. So the romanticized discourse of idealized marriage is a fantasy of sovereignty, as is the 1960s idea of sexual liberation. These discourses offer us a sense that our intimate practices can, in different ways, fulfill us and make us whole. Many queer theorists, especially those who theorize queer men's sexual cultures, so people like Leo Bassani and the Edelman, think this fantasy of sovereignty is, to put it in the crudest terms possible, bad, precisely because it's a fantasy. Intimate relationships can never make us feel complete. We are fundamentally non-sovereign. For these scholars, accepting and inhabiting our non-sovereignty as fully as we can is the ideal ethical position. Now, non-sovereignty explicitly becomes vulnerability, as I said before, in the work of Anne Tvetovich, who draws on Leo Bassani in an essay that she wrote on butch femme lesbian intimacies. And also in Catherine Angel's recent book, Tomorrow Sex Will Be Good Again, which is about heterosexual women. As Angel writes, in all sex, we are quintessentially vulnerable. For Tvetovich, the experience of being vulnerable is both welcome and difficult, and hence profoundly transformative. The notion of control that was so prevalent amongst our participants is completely at odds with the theorization of vulnerability and non-sovereignty, with this theorization of vulnerability. It's the fantasy of sovereignty that you can exercise control in your intimate life in any meaningful way. These writers, one imagines, would caution against our participants using their smartphones to gain a sense of control over the parts of their intimate lives where they felt most vulnerable. Indeed, Kane Race does this very thing in Reflections on Gay Men's Hookup App Use, which he argues punish users with the promise of control over their erotic engagements. He ends these reflections expressing concern that this promise of control forecloses the possibilities of more diverse, experimental, and transformative cultures of intimacy. Now, before I reflect any further on the ethics of vulnerability and control, I'm going to move the discussion to a more conjunctural register and ask, why are queer men defining intimacy in terms of vulnerability and using smartphones to gain a sense of control over this vulnerability now? What is it about the present historical conjuncture that would produce this particular formation of smartphone-mediated intimacy? So in political theorist Paolo Gibaldo's recently published book, he argues that the discursive horizon of the present conjuncture is defined by the triad of sovereignty, control, and protection, the master signifiers of our era. Our culture's current preoccupation with, for our purposes, sovereignty and control has emerged, according to Gibaldo and many others, as a result of the multiple conjunctural crises that we're now experiencing. These crises have come about largely due to the unraveling of neoliberalism that started in 2008 with the financial crisis, but intensified after the global rise of populism as, in Gibaldo's words, the negation of neoliberalism, which manifested itself in the UK, well, in multiple ways, but most kind of visibly through the Brexit vote. Since its inception, the neoliberal project has always had popular sovereignty in its sights, seeking to replace the control that democratically accountable public institutions give us with privatized free markets. It's precisely neoliberalism's deepening of non-sovereignty that has led to the desire for more sovereignty, which found its most visible expression in the Leave campaign's conjuncture-defining slogan, "Take back control." Other writers point to the economic precarity experienced by so many of us under neoliberalism, especially after the crash and the austerity measures introduced in response. And Judith Butler has defined precarity as the unequal distribution of vulnerability. Collective sense of unequally distributed vulnerability has only intensified during the coronavirus conjuncture, especially for those designated as belonging to vulnerable groups, in which there have been mostly unsuccessful attempts, in the words of another famous political slogan, to control the virus. So from our perspective, the appearance of vulnerability and control in the project is not just evidence of the ontological operations of intimacy. It also points to the conjunctural intensification of non-sovereignty that has come in the wake of neoliberalism's unraveling. How much more vulnerable it has made us feel, and the sense of control that so many of us desire as a result. The queer men we spoke to inhabit this conjuncture as much as anyone else, and that this structure of feeling should pervade their experiences of intimacy makes sense from the perspective of conjunctural analysis, with its understanding of all domains of the social formation over-determining each other in complex and unpredictable ways. There are, however, more specific ways that queer men and other queer communities have been made to feel more vulnerable in the current conjuncture. Much has been made in recent cultural analysis of how white, cis, able-bodied, educationally and economically privileged gay men have benefited from the neoliberal settlement and its attendant politics of homonormativity. And I don't disagree, but our research shows a more complex picture for even these men, let alone queer men with less capital, queer trans men, queer men of color, and queer men living with disabilities. For instance, a neoliberal economy geared towards property speculation, combined with austerity measures and pandemic restrictions have led to the reduction and closures of spaces that different queer communities have historically relied on to feel safe, indeed less vulnerable. Places like bars, nightclubs, sex on premises venues, other community spaces and sexual health services. So a key feature of our crisis-ridden conjuncture has been the so-called culture wars, which have been defined by sustained and highly visible attacks on trans folk and people of colour who are engaged in various political struggles to make their lives more livable. The recent emergence of the Black Trans Lives Matter movement being exemplary of both. The media debates over trans bodily sovereignty, indeed the very fact of trans existence, is central to these attacks. So this has on and offline dimensions, with persistent trolling of trans folk and people of colour across a range of online platforms, including from queer men on hookup apps. So our participants spoke in unexpected ways about navigating this particular terrain. Both our participants of colour and our trans participants spoke of the ambivalence they felt when people connected with them on hookup apps to perform allyship, preferring to be left to the cruising they had gone on the app to do. Now here we see the conjunctural shaping the intimate in a very direct way. There's also been a related rise in reports of violence against all categories of the LGBTQ+ spectrum, including white cis gay men and women. Homophobia has not been exhausted as a social force, despite the political gains made in the name of cis gay men and women. In short, queer life in all its intersections has become yet more vulnerable in the current conjuncture. And given this, it's no surprise that queer men are using aspects of their smartphones in an attempt to gain a sense of control over the points where this vulnerability feels like too much to bear. Okay, so I'd like to conclude the presentation in two ways. First, I'd like to reflect a bit on the ethics of vulnerability and control in the context of queer men's smartphone-mediated intimacies. Then I'd like to conclude by making the case for the value of bringing conjunctural analysis together with research on digital intimacies. In terms of the ethics of non-sovereignty, in some sense, the approach that we're taking isn't necessarily about intervening into this debate on whether or not queer men should use digital media as a means to strive for sovereignty in their intimate lives. The point of the project has been to map the historical conditions in which the desire for sovereignty has intensified across the social formation. Having said this, despite the compelling case that queer theorists have made for not only accepting, but also being transformed by our non-sovereignty, we cannot help but feel sympathetic to our participants' desire for control within these historical conditions. At a time of multiple political crises, when so much feels out of control, there is a logic in trying to exercise more control in one of the few areas left where you think you can, even if it's an unrealizable fantasy. It's also worth reflecting on the fact that queer theorists in these debates do not make the distinction between the two different forms of sovereignty, two different forms of non-sovereignty or vulnerability that both Catherine Angel does and that our participants talked about. The sort of control that queer theorists caution against is clearly different to the desire for control over the vulnerability to violence you might be exposed to in your search for intimacy, racist, transphobic, homophobic, or otherwise. So we're certain these scholars wouldn't disagree. It's just this distinction is not explicitly made in the literature on these questions. Finally, on using conjunctural analysis to research digital intimacies. In the context of research on digital intimacies, we found that conjunctural analysis has served a double function. We would argue that it enriches our understandings of intimacy, digital, queer, or otherwise. As I said at the beginning of the presentation, these intimacies do not take place in a vacuum. Mapping the arrangement of the conjuncture in which they take place gives us a more precise sense of what these intimacies look like, as well as their historical significance. Conversely, research into cultures of intimacy, what forms they take, how they are struggled over and for, and how they intersect with other societal domains, deepens our understanding of how a social formation is arranged during a particular conjuncture, strengthening the analytical power of conjunctural analysis. There has been a revival of interest in conjunctural analysis over the past few years, with research monographs using the method and special issues of journals dedicated to it. All of these use capital P politics as their way into understanding different conjunctures, which, if nothing else, is contrary to the spirit of the origins of the methodology at the CCCS, with its innovations in the analysis of popular culture. I would argue that intimacy should be added to the practice of conjunctural analysis. It has shown us two things: the types and textures of queer male relationships that have been potentiated and constrained by current historical arrangements, and it has also given us access to what it feels like to inhabit these arrangements and the desires that emerge in response. How ordinary people feel and what they desire in their everyday lives is critical to understand if we want to persuade them to consent to more progressive political projects. And really finally, I would like to contribute to the case others are making within cultural studies for the revival of conjunctural analysis as a methodology that needs to be adopted more widely within the discipline. Some cultural studies professors go to conferences and argue that if you're not doing conjunctural analysis, then you're not doing cultural studies. Now, I don't believe this, but I do believe in the value of collectively analysing cultural formations in an endeavour to better understand what it feels like to live in such fraught, anxious, and crisis-ridden times, so we can work together to bring about less vulnerable futures. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we've got a bit of time for questions, and there might be people online with questions as well. I've just asked them to pop them in the chat, if that's okay. I'm going to have to run with you to the microphone there, so if anyone wants to go, do you want to put your hand up? And I'll run with you to the microphone. Anna? I'll point it in your direction. Okay. I tried it yesterday. It's really not very
good. Regarding using digital technology to mediate this between individuals, do you think that this kind of social phenomena is are likely to occur within queer communities, like specifically between queer men? Do you think it's like specifically like a queer phenomena?
Very long process.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think increasingly less so. I think that it's increasingly normalized now that the way most people are going to meet each other is over some sort of communication. In terms of the specificity of queerness, it's kind of what we talked about before, that I definitely think that there are aspects of queer life which make it the internet more amenable to connecting people who otherwise wouldn't have had the means to connect with each other in schools or in other sorts of community settings. But in terms of intimate life, no. The only thing that I think there's a specificity to when it comes to queer men is the kind of the value placed on casual sex is a greater, I mean, it's kind of contested within queer men culture, but that I think it's just empirically observable that and true that queer men have a more complicated cultures of casual sex, and in that respect, certain types of platforms are used in certain types of ways to mediate that. But yeah, that's how I think most things intersect.
I go to the chat. Can I do that? Yes, there's lots of comments saying thank you. Rosalind Gill says, what a wonderful talk. Thank you so much, Jamie. Extremely helpful for my learning and work and a fully useful framework for understanding lived experiences. And then B's asked a question. So it's fantastic to see your research challenging stereotypes around queer intimacies and around digital spaces as inherently harmful. Do you see a way forward to bringing these more nuanced readings of queer digital culture into wider discussion?
Well, the thing that immediately comes to mind is we made a fanzine, which tries to do that. The problem is trying to distribute it, if you maybe want to give that out. Yeah, I mean, it's really difficult, actually, because I think that perception is so pervasive, even within gay culture. So kind of mainstream gay magazines and kind of media outlets often rely on exactly this idea that of queer men being kind of dangerously addicted to their a particular type of sexual culture, which not all queer men kind of engage with, and also the ways that digital media kind of intersect with that. And I find it very difficult to imagine how that might be dislodged, to be honest with you. I'm doing my absolute best to try and do that. And there are definitely people within the field that I work in that want to do similar things, but it's difficult for academics, unfortunately, to have the same power as queer cultural producers. So I'll do my best to distribute that fanzine. There are only 300 printed, so it's not going to have that much impact. I mean, I get through the research that we do, you know, I hope that we change some people's minds about what queer cultures mean.
There's people in the chat saying, I want a zine.
There's a link.
There's a link. There's a digital copy.
Version, and I'll send it. Yeah.
Lovely. Right, we'll send it. They're asking for a digital one. That's lovely. And maybe people in the room who don't have one as well might want a digital one. May.
I find it really interesting to hear what you're talking about in the digital world, but it makes me think about one of my lecturers, Thaddeus. I don't know if any of you will know him, but he's very into queer culture alongside subculture and then crime. And he looked in particular at the rave scene, which began with Black, gay and queer communities. And it's really interesting that the rave scene has now been turned into something that is mainstream. And do you think possibly that's what's happened with digital media and intimacy, as it began as a queer phenomenon and now it's become mainstream for everyone to sort of rely on digital things as well?
I don't know, is the honest question to that question. I mean, I would have to do a little bit more work comparing kind of when the take-up of certain types of digitally mediated digital technologies to mediate kind of intimate relationships between people. There is definitely a perception that I'm pretty certain Grindr and Gaydar were probably the first to do this sort of work. I mean, I'm not sure how it kind of bears in relation to Plenty of Fish and to Tinder and to kind of similar. I don't know. I mean, I know that it became. I don't even know this. My sense is that it became less embarrassing for queer people to say they'd met their partner on digital intimacy. But yeah, I mean, we were talking before, actually, Deborah's just gone, about the makeup that we were discussing in the thing before, and about how that was how certain makeup techniques have been co-opted by mainstream makeup tutorials. And so there is definitely a pattern there. But that is an interesting point that I would like to be more precise about. But yeah, I can't say for sure.
I was just wondering if you've thought a bit about how your research might get taken up and get used. So, you know, Microsoft want you over to, you know, help develop better queer apps and better. So, I mean, one of the things we've been talking about on the module is the need for kind of feminist technological design and queer technological design. And I wondered if any of your insights or any of the responses said anything about certain kinds of affordances that were more helpful than others, that, you know, feed into that kind of language around the design of these platforms. And, you know, if vulnerability and control is central, you know, there's lots of things about protecting yourself now, etc. And I wonder if there's anything more that you know around that.
I can try it with that if you like. I'm going to try this one with the audience.
So this is a really interesting and important question, and one that I think is much more complicated than people think, because I think, Helen, like you, I probably come out of a tradition of cultural studies that is anti-technologically deterministic, and so whatever you design, it in some ways it doesn't make a difference because the way it's used is so multiple and complex. And so I think that we do need to think about those things, but we also need to understand those things in terms of a much broader kind of historical, changes beyond the kind of affordances of particular platforms. And the thing that makes me think that is in the interviews, we were doing them in the middle of lockdown, which was also the same time as Black Lives Matter. And one of the things that Grindr did was remove the ethnicity filters. Because there was a discourse claiming that ethnicity filters were a way to screen out people of color, the people you weren't interested in. The people of color we spoke to really didn't want the ethnicity filters removed because they were using it to find other people of color to form kind of connections and communities too. So I think it's Adebisi that says, he liked the ethnicity filters because he could sum up a whole kind of screen full of queer people of color in and around his community that he didn't know existed. So whilst I've seen good research and I understand the imperative for thinking about this stuff at the level of design, that becomes so much more complicated in terms of real life use. And that was the best example I can think of that kind of illustrates that. Yes. I think that's a very specific question. Yeah.
You have said a very specific question.
Okay, that's fine. The interesting thing about trying to do this and explain what conjunctural analysis is that every person that claims to be interested in it also says there is no such method. There is no strict methodology. There is no text that tells you how to or what to do. Stuart Hall talks about thinking and feeling his way through a particular conjuncture, and I think Lawrence Grossberg recently wrote an article for New Formations which said, he went through all the texts that he could, and there is no text that tells you how to do it. Policing the Crisis doesn't tell you really how. I mean, you can tell how it's been done, but it doesn't tell you how to do it. But in principle, yes. I mean, Eurodance will tell you something about the historical space and time that it's emerged in. And indeed, music, I think, is one that is often used, particularly in relation to questions of structures of feeling, what it feels like to... Larry Grossberg is a person who's interested in popular music as a way into understanding particular political contexts. So there is a quite strong tradition of using music to try to understand historical conjunctures, yeah.
And yet also talked about the increasing tax on film.
Yeah. Homonormativity is an interesting one because I think it's something that's initially when Lisa Dugan, I always forget whether she coins or popularizes the term, but she's talking about a set of positions that are put forward by particular right-wing political thinkers that are trying to mainstream kind of gay politics. So it's really identifying a particular discursive strategy at a particular moment in time. And it's one of those concepts that just gets kind of moved around quite a lot in quite a loose and baggy way to mean lots of different things. And often within queer politics, it's used as a kind of, as a way of kind of decrying a certain type of kind of lived experience, and the kind of difference between the discursive and the lived experience. There's a gap that needs to be thought through, basically, and whilst I think that there is definitely identifiable trends within popular culture which are clearly recognizably homonormative, the family that I use in my lectures when I teach this to undergraduates is Modern Family, Cam and Mitchell, who I think are hilarious enough, but they're a perfect example of what a homonormative family might look like. But in terms of lived experience, I mean, the example that I've used is the violence against queer people and the sorts of people who have come to represent homonormative life in popular culture, and that might be because there are better reporting mechanisms now, or the media think it's something that's worth reporting on in a way that they didn't. I don't know whether tangibly there's a, but the fact that simply because a man is holding a hand with another man in the street gets beaten up, you know, shows you that no matter how hegemonic homonormativity is as an idea in culture, what that looks like on the street, and then how that intersects with all the other things that, you know, I've talked about, it doesn't tell you everything that you need to know about what it is to be gay. Yeah, sure. So when I first started doing my PhD, so my background is, as is probably clear, is in cultural studies and British cultural studies, and I've always been very taken by, you know, that way of understanding and interpreting the world. And when I started doing my PhD, the kind of affective turn was becoming much more prominent, not just within queer theory, but across different sorts of things. And I'm interested in, you know, structures of feeling. I'm interested in, you know, what things feel like to inhabit and how that mobilizes people to doing things or not doing certain things. And so there's a kind of Deleuzean way into that. And Larry Grossberg kind of tries to put the two together, and I think is mostly successful. And partially it comes out, the way that I do stuff partially comes out from the way he kind of does stuff. You know, there's some really important and useful work in affect theory, and so Laurent Ballant is the person I can think of the most, and that's because throughout their career they continuously tried to put together questions of affect with political questions and understandings of political structures. There's a lot of affect theory that doesn't do that, and for me becomes less interesting because it doesn't help. It ends up being a kind of phenomenology of micro events, which is often beautifully written, but doesn't quite get to the, you know, the thing that I think is significant about the cultural, personally. I mean, you know, people use it in different ways and use it brilliantly, but in terms of the series of questions that I want to ask, it's the bringing, and it's not actually particularly popular, you know, that way into it isn't used quite as much. You know, the affective tone has had an enormous impact on humanities, and they're not using these ideas. They're using Nasumi and Sedgwick, and they, you know, there's a particular type of register of speaking which is I don't always vibe with, because it doesn't, the political can sometimes be lost in that. So there's, it's that way in, and thinking about affect and feeling within the kind of historical kind of, so structure of feeling is a great concept to, even though, yeah, to do that with, basically. So it's the bringing of the two together, which I find particularly useful.
Relating to the question, I'm taking up the findings.
What's next is that we have to write a book. Just a small thing that's coming together. In terms of impact, we were working with Terence Higgins Trust, Waverley Care, and London Friend, and we were consulting with them the whole way through. And actually, we did an end of project symposium where they respond to some of what we found. And I think that you know, that the people that they're client facing. They work with kind of queer men, and London Friends in particular works with queer men with addiction problems or identify as having addiction problems, and so they're very familiar with the kind of discourses and languages that are used to describe the sorts of things that they're interested in. And in some ways, what we provided didn't surprise them because they know up front actually what goes on. But it just what it helps them do is it legitimizes their kind of face-to-face experience, having a university researcher, you know, say this is so they will be using it, and they will be using it, the fanzine particularly, to speak to the queer men that they, you know, to talk about, to try and dislodge the ideas around what queer sexual cultures are, what hookup apps are. And of course, it's up to those people whether they use them or not, but just to know this isn't the exclusive experience. Like, so, you know, I'm hoping that it has an impact. I mean, we're going to be continuing to kind of follow up with them afterwards. In terms of what's next in the book, and in terms of participants, we need to speak to them to find out, actually. I mean, I always express frustration because I didn't do the interviews for this. We had a postdoc do it, and I will never design a project like that again because it's so nice to be in a room with people and find out stuff. And it also means that when people ask me questions, like, I know, you know, reading interview transcripts isn't the same as doing 40 interviews. So I can't speak with, I mean, if James was here, he'd be able to tell you something. One thing I do remember is, you know, these popular ideas do around kind of queer men's cultures of intimacy, you know, queer men do use them to make sense of their own lives. And we did a focus group at the very beginning, and it was interesting to start from, you know, people say, I'm glad that you're doing this important work because people will know how horrific, you know, these things are. And it's like, eh. And then through the course of the conversation and in discussion with other people, you see them kind of realize, oh yeah, you know, my boyfriend does send me love hearts on my phone. My phone isn't an, do you know? So I mean, there has been a kind of opening up to the multiple ways.
I think that's something that we technology think that I think that when someone comes there, right, line, phone, and that we kind of said, you know, I mean, not in the house, right? You can just not kind of see that.
Yeah.
Or you can, you know, you'll see a text. That kind of
Yeah. I mean, and it goes back to what we were discussing before, you know, the way that, you know, I completely agree with, you know, Tracy, what you were saying about, you know, techno. At the same time, you know, there's also technophobia, and it seems, you know, the best concept that I have at the moment to think about this stuff, the hegemonic struggle that happens in these spaces, and they happen in particular ways in these spaces, and these spaces are connected to offline spaces in complicated ways. And part of what we're trying to do in the project is map those tensions and those pulls and those struggles, which, you know, happen politically, but also happen in the intimate realm, which is of course also political. And so that's partly what the project was about trying to do, was about trying to map. And honestly, you know, the vulnerability and control was a genuine surprise. You know, the vulnerability was a genuine, and it was so, it just kept coming up again and again. And then the control we had to work to code a bit more, but the vulnerability came up explicitly over and over again. And it was, you know, there's important work that's done with kids that perhaps don't understand the techniques that the people we spoke to. They always, I mean, Udam, who was in a particular social location and particular types of vulnerability, which made it difficult, although he does exercise control. They were continuously doing both at the same time. And yeah, so that space of tension and negotiation and struggle, I think, is the most interesting, the most useful way I can think of intervening in those debates about techno-utopia and technophobia. And Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one for us because, you know, as I said in the presentation, you know, I don't think the block I don't think the block function is anti-racism solved. Do you know what I mean? I just want to make sure that people don't think that I think that. But yeah, I mean, I guess the ways that we've been thinking about it is much more in terms, you know, of this conjunctural thing. You know, not, I mean, the project is interested absolutely in providing empirical kind of evidence to show, you know, how queer men use their smartphones in a bid to kind of upend some of the more problematic stereotypes. And so in that respect, the fact of control is super fascinating because on that level, it's super fascinating because of the out of control discourse, which is so prevalent. It is so prevalent and is so damaging, I think. So there's that. But then the question of, you know, the desire for control, we've been thinking about. That's a very complicated question. I'm trying to kind of articulate it clearly, because then there's also the academic debate, which, as I say, Kane Ray says, you know, you shouldn't control this part of your life because you should be open to change and difference and transformation. I don't know, maybe you should. That's a very seductive idea. But then there's also the kind of more, the wider political thing here, like what does the desire for control mean at this current moment? What is the desire for more sovereignty mean at this current moment? And actually, politically, you know, Paolo Gibaldo's, that book has been very useful because the findings are kind of the same, actually, in a very different register, in a very different context. And he's not engaging with the queer theory ideas around sovereignty. You know, he's much more schematically organizes kind of political movements into kind of reactionary forms of sovereignty, so Brexit, controlling the border, but also more democratic forms of sovereignty. So, you know, trans-bodily sovereignty, you might argue, is a more progressive form of sovereignty. He also talks about food sovereignty and then the sovereignty over the environment. And also, you know, if neoliberalism is the negation of sovereignty, having more democratic control is a thing that we want. You know, it's so. I know these theoretical traditions aren't speaking to each other. You know, I know they are working slightly separately, and there is a difference between the subjective and the intimate and the conjunctural. But I think it is useful putting those things in kind of conversation. So for me, it's not so much refusal. It's more about, you know, it's more about exercising some sort of agency or power, even if it's in a limited way, even if it doesn't add up to a kind of massive political struggle. Again, you know, we sympathise with the desire for more control, despite all the precaution, you know, the cautions, notes of caution that queer theorists. Do you see? That was a bit rambly, but yeah, I think trying to get to something there.
About whether you should block people or whether you should. There's also something. You know, at what point is that? I know it's not.
Yeah, what you're saying, I think, opens up a whole host of like very complicated issues, like why are these private platforms the people mediating, the people that mediating our public space? You know, why is it Mark Zuckerberg making decisions about who, or Elon Musk making decisions about who and how people engage, and whether hate speech is free speech, or these private individuals completely undemocratically making those decisions and designing, you know, the platforms in particular ways, and you know, there's that issue, and then there's the other issue of, you know, how you feel. So one of the things that was interesting was I touched on at the end that a lot of the queer people of color we spoke to didn't want people to perform allyship with them on the hookup app because it was not the space. It was, the therapist that was speaking, Anthony, was saying that Black Lives Matter was a very difficult thing for him. It wasn't a joyous thing for him. It was a really complicated thing for him. And he didn't want to have to, you know, he went to Grindr to switch off from that a bit, perhaps. He didn't want to be in that space and have to explain it to white people who, for all intents and purposes, were doing the right political thing. When we told that to, when we gave that anecdote to a partner who works a project, kind of semi-official project partner at Blackout, which is an organisation. He's an activist and he works for this Black gay men's organisation. He was like, "No, this is a teachable moment. You should be engaging with these people. It's like da 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 da." And it's like, yeah, I mean, also that's right, but for an individual in their intimate life, is that right? So there's a whole, I don't know what the right thing is, and academics with public personas on, but you know, the social location is also an important thing to consider here. And yeah, I don't think I haven't got a straightforward answer for that. It just, that's a I mean, I'm familiar with that project and it's a super interesting one. And I can see how it opens up a whole load of potentially unresolvable issues when it comes to these questions. Yeah. So I mean, when we write this stuff up, we're going to be having to take into account the kind of political economy of the apps, and you know, the sorts of subjectivities that get potentiated within this political economy, whether they're taken up or not by the people or not. In terms of the interviews, I mean, you know, the Shoshana Zuboff argument is, we consent to things that we have no idea what we're consenting to. And there was a couple of people that were cognizant of these elements of capture and did what they could to game and hide and switch off things as well. So they were trying to get control over the way that they're, yeah, mostly, you know, Shoshana Zuboff is right, to my mind. We're oblivious to, you know, the people in their everyday lives are kind of oblivious to that. So, I mean, I'm in the presentation, I'm always careful of saying to try and gain a sense of control. They get a feeling of control, whether they're getting control, you know, whether they're getting control or not, in the more political sense, in the way that you're talking about, or, you know, over the kind of sense of intimacy in their intimate, like in that more kind of intimate way. I mean, I think I'm kind of going tangential to this, but you know, that question of the fantasy of sovereignty is a key one that is debated in queer theory. And there's a book by Lee Edelman and Lauren Ballant who disagree over the place of these fantasies. And Lauren Ballant believes we need these fantasies to make our lives more bearable. And Lee Edelman thinks that's just ideology. That's, you know, it's not anywhere. And I'm more Ballantian in that respect. I'm sympathetic to this, you know, the sense of control you think you might have, even though the wider system that you're working in is doing the exact opposite in some ways. But yeah, you're right. It's important to bring that up and to think about both of those things, I think. Thank you. Thank you.